Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, extras on the cast of Indiana Jones. Both sides in today's debate agree on two fundamental propositions. That democracies, on occasion, have to fight wars. And secondly, that democracies necessarily have to fight wars well. The problem of the entire government case is that they jeopardise our ability to fight wars in the first instance, but secondly, to effectively be able to win them. Before I get to our extension, which is built around those two planks, I want to ask first what the deliberative effects of this policy are. Because we would question whether the pictures of the mutilated corpses of soldiers comes with an abridged copy of Grotius that every CNN outlet necessarily has to give to a viewer. The opening government wanted to say that this would mean we would fight good wars. It was contradictory with their idea that it would the public would learn about the impact of violence that would happen. But the second thing they said is that it meant that we won't fight bad wars. One, there's a time lag problem with that argument, because the problem is that you're only jeopardising the ability to fight the next war because the war they're talking about has already begun. Two, we're not prohibiting at the moment the reporting of atrocities. And this intersects with what the closing government apparently tried to extend on. Like, we don't need to see Lindy England's camcorder from Abu Ghraib or the graphic imagery of Auschwitz in terms of like the SS home picture footage of how the gas chambers worked to appreciate the moral consequences of what is at stake there. We think the public is capable of adjudicating the gravity of evil without necessarily being confronted with the specific image of that evil in its entirety. So, secondly, like, what are the costs of war? Because we would suggest that the idea that war is insignificant died with 1.1 million French fathers that never saw their kids in World War I and the 60,000 English troops that died on the first day of the Somme. One, their assertion that generals are like warmongering idiots is ridiculous. These are people who offer their lives to their country and often actually are very serious about when they send forces to war. Like Colin Powell said there was no higher responsibility than the lives of his men, which explained why he only deployed them in the most important circumstances. Two, like politicians are not glib about the consequences of going to war. There's a reason why Barack Obama got labelled Hamlet by the Potomac when he spent over 9 months deciding whether or not to adopt the recommendations of the McChrystal report. But thirdly, like the public at the moment already has an ingrained skepticism about war. Like in the instance of the Iraq War, most publics actually opposed that particular war. So we don't think that there is like this necessarily universal glibness about the costs of war that necessarily means their policy is worthwhile. The third thing that we would say is it is not acceptable for them to be as glib as they are about the suffering of the casualties of this policy. One, the important point here is that you're taking away the choice of families to control whether or not they see the circumstances in which their loved ones die. But two, that the cultural sensitivity of that has political implications. Like it would not be good for the West, given sort of Islamic sensitivities about presentation of death, to be constantly advertising images of the implications of Western policy. Third, fourth, we say when it comes to improving the conduct of wars, the closing government's extension. One, we're not against any reporting of atrocities. Two, we think there's massive safeguards that already exist to prevent atrocities happening. Like the fact soldiers are not barbarians. The fact that the militaries have accountability regimes. Third, the fact that it is against the law to break the rules of law. But we don't need a graphic image to necessarily improve that process of accountability. So, why does this stop democracies fighting against war? The opening opposition have already talked about the public bias against violence. But we would say further that it's already difficult for democracies to fight good wars in two main ways. One, publics can't actually appreciate the strategic calculus of why a war needs to be fought. And two, they can't necessarily appreciate the utilitarian calculus that justifies that war. So we think it is, in principle, perfectly legitimate for governments to withhold information in order to preserve the public will towards war, given that the public is structurally incapable of appreciating the reason why that war needs to be fought and the consequences of what that war. Like FDR systematically lied to the American people for the late 30s and early 40s about US support for the arms build-up in Western Europe, like by giving sort of lots of military backing to the Allies against Hitler. Now, if the public found out about that, it would never have happened. So,
let me get this straight. You're now saying that we'd have better public policy if citizens were kept uninformed so that politicians can do what they please.
no, that is like a ridiculous misinterpretation of what I'm saying. I'm saying that at some point it is perfectly legitimate for governments to control the types of information and the access of information that is distributed to the public because it makes a prior commitment to fight a war. But we say like there's like an interesting problem here. What happens is there's like a false equivalence on the basis of image. So the public thinks that their war is just as morally integral as the enemy's war because all they're seeing is the enemy, is the casualties. We think that leads to basic risk aversion where the public can't process probabilities. So take the example of Somalia and Rwanda. We think that when the American public saw soldiers being dragged through the streets of Mogadishu, that meant that they had no goodwill to then go into Rwanda, which we think, as they acknowledge, would have been a very good war. But the final thing we say is that why it stops democracies fighting wars is that when we empower enemy propaganda with the images that in this case will be presented without the necessary context and be presented in very slanted ways, the credibility of our soft power is inevitably damaged. So two, why does this undermine our capacity to prosecute wars? Everyone acknowledges that some wars are worth fighting. We say one, the problem with this policy is it necessarily emboldens the enemy. Because once you release the information, you lose control of the message, and these images will be interpreted in particular ways against our strategic interests. Two, it hurts operational flexibility. Like these guys err too far in a mythical distinction between what is strategic and important and what is not. Like it is not in the interest to have reporters embedded with every army unit on the front lines in every field hospitals just because they're like roving a human rights atrocities reporters. The third thing we say is there's enormous unintended effects. One, in terms of like risk-averse tactics that will be pursued by militaries, because they don't want their soldiers to actually die, and they don't want sort of like very graphic casualties, so it's more drones and things like that. It also means more proxy forces, because they don't want to use their own forces to confront public image, which necessarily like harms accountability if that's what they're on about, and also undermines the credibility of that war. Mr. Speaker, because this undermines our capacity to fight good wars, and does so in a manner which undermines our capacity to wage war, we proudly oppose.